The tension in the courtroom was thick, almost suffocating. Officer Greg Larson sat rigidly in his chair, his hands gripping the table in front of him. His face, usually smug and full of authority, was now pale, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. Across the room, the woman he had arrested just days ago sat calmly, her expression unreadable. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't intimidated. And that made him even more uneasy. When Officer Larson had pulled her over that night, he had assumed it would be a routine stop. A black woman driving a sleek black SUV through an upscale neighborhood? Suspicious. In his mind, she didn't belong there. He had followed her for blocks, his patrol car's lights flashing, until she finally pulled over. She had been calm, polite even, but there was something about her confidence that irritated him. She didn't show fear. She didn't scramble for an excuse or fumble over her words like so many others did when faced with his authority. And that had set him off. What started as a simple traffic stop quickly escalated. He accused her of resisting, though the dashcam footage would later show she had simply asked why she was being detained. He had handcuffed her, taken her to the station, and charged her with obstruction. At the time, he had no idea who he was dealing with. But now, in court, the truth was about to come out. As she stood to address the judge, Officer Larson's stomach twisted into knots. There was something in the way she carried herself, in the way the judge's eyes flickered with recognition when she stated her full name, that made him realize he had made a terrible mistake. Then she spoke. Her voice was clear, steady, and filled with quiet authority. "Your Honor," she said, locking eyes with Larson, "my name is Danielle Carter. I am the chief of the FBI." A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Larson's mouth went dry. His heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear the murmurs spreading through the room. He felt the weight of the judge's gaze, the subtle smirks of the attorneys who had likely known this information long before he did. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. The woman he had treated like a criminal, the woman he had arrogantly dragged into court, was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country? Danielle didn't blink. She didn't gloat or raise her voice. She simply let the words settle, watching as realization dawned on him. He had been so sure of his authority, so certain that he had the power in this situation. But now, it was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And just like that, his career, his reputation, and his entire future hung in the balance. Meanwhile, across town on a crowded city bus, 17-year-old Marcus Williams shifted in his seat, glancing up as the bus doors opened. A tired-looking woman stepped inside, one hand resting on her swollen belly. She scanned the packed bus, her shoulders slumping slightly, when she saw there were no empty seats. Without hesitation, Marcus stood. "Ma'am, you can take my seat," he said with a small smile. The woman's eyes widened for a moment before a grateful smile spread across her face. "Oh, thank you, sweetheart," she said, easing into the seat with a sigh of relief. "Bless you." Marcus just nodded and grabbed onto the overhead rail, swaying slightly as the bus started moving again. He didn't think much of it. His mama had raised him to be respectful, and giving up a seat to someone in need was just the right thing to do. He didn't expect anything in return. But a few minutes later, the woman reached into her bag, pulled out a small piece of folded paper, and pressed it into his hand. "Read this when you get off the bus," she whispered with a knowing smile. Marcus looked down at the note, confused but intrigued. What could it possibly say? As the bus rumbled down the street, he turned the paper over in his fingers, curiosity gnawing at him. Little did he know, that small note was about to change his life forever. This intro builds suspense in both storylines while keeping it natural, engaging, and human-centered. Let me know if you'd like any tweaks. The courtroom remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Officer Larson's palms were slick with sweat, his mind scrambling for a way out of the nightmare he had just walked into. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been in control. He had been the one calling the shots. But now, as he sat there, his whole world teetered on the edge of collapse. Danielle Carter didn't look at him with anger or contempt. She didn't need to. The quiet confidence in her expression was enough. It was the look of someone who knew exactly how this was going to play out. She had seen men like him before, officers who let their badge turn into a weapon against the very people they were supposed to protect. And now, she was the one holding the power. The judge cleared his throat, shuffling through the papers in front of him. He had already known the truth, but watching the realization dawn on Larson was something else entirely. "Chief Carter," the judge said slowly, his voice carrying a weight of authority. "Would you like to continue?" Larson swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He was supposed to be in control of this case. He had thought she was just another woman trying to challenge his authority, someone he could put in her place. But he had played himself. Danielle nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned slightly, her gaze settling on Larson. "I want to make it very clear why we're here today." Her voice was even, steady. "Officer Larson stopped me without probable cause. He escalated a situation that should have never gone beyond a conversation. And then, instead of admitting his mistake, he doubled down, filing false charges." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Larson could feel eyes on him from every direction. He wanted to sink into the floor, disappear before the inevitable fallout. Danielle continued. "This isn't about me," she said, her tone growing sharper. "I have resources. I have the ability to stand in this courtroom and defend myself. But what about the people who don't? How many others has he done this to? How many never made it to this point because they were too afraid to fight back?" The judge glanced toward the prosecution, his expression unreadable. "Chief Carter, are you saying you have evidence to support these claims?" Danielle smiled. It wasn't smug or triumphant. It was the smile of someone who had been playing chess while Larson had been playing checkers. "Yes, Your Honor," she said simply. Larson's heart dropped. He had made a mistake. A big one. And there was no one doing it now. Across town, Marcus stepped off the bus, still clutching the small folded note in his hand. The paper felt warm against his palm, like it had absorbed the energy of the woman who had given it to him. He hesitated before unfolding it, something in his gut telling him that whatever was inside would change everything. Taking a deep breath, he slowly peeled the note open, his eyes scanning the words written in neat, careful handwriting. "Meet me at this address tomorrow at 3 p.m. You don't know it yet, but this moment is going to change your life." Underneath, an address was scrawled out in bold ink. Marcus blinked, reading the message again, trying to make sense of it. Who was this woman? And why did she think meeting her would change his life? For a second, he considered throwing the note away. Maybe it was some kind of joke. Maybe she had written the wrong person. But something about the way she had looked at him, the way her eyes had softened like she knew something he didn't, kept him from crumpling the paper. He shoved it into his pocket, his mind racing. He had always believed in small acts of kindness, but he had never expected one to come back around like this. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his fingers kept tracing the edges of the note. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but deep down, he knew there was no way he could ignore it. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter sat in her office, reviewing the files spread out in front of her. This case was bigger than just Larson. It always had been. There were more officers like him, ones who had been getting away with this kind of behavior for years. And now she had the chance to expose it. She leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, but she was ready. Across the city, Officer Larson wasn't sleeping. He sat alone in his apartment, staring at his reflection in the dark window. He had made a mistake that could cost him everything. And he wasn't sure how to stop what was coming next. And Marcus? He still had no idea that the simple decision he had made on that bus would lead him down a path he never could have imagined. But by tomorrow afternoon, everything would change. The next morning, Marcus woke up earlier than usual, the note still tucked under his pillow. He pulled it out and read it again, as if the words might change overnight. They hadn't. The address was still there, the message still the same. He had no idea what to expect, but there was something inside him, some strange pull, that told him he had to go. At breakfast, his mom noticed his distraction. "You good, baby?" she asked, watching him push his eggs around his plate. Marcus hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just got a lot on my mind." She gave him a knowing look. "Well, whatever it is, trust yourself. You got a good heart. That'll lead you where you need to go." He nodded, but he didn't tell her about the note. He didn't know why, maybe because it felt too strange to explain, or maybe because he wasn't sure if he even believed it himself. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Larson sat in his patrol car, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He was supposed to be on duty, but his mind wasn't on his job. He was too busy replaying everything that had happened in the courtroom. Danielle Carter, FBI chief. He still couldn't believe it. He had arrested an FBI chief. Worse than that, she had evidence against him. He didn't know what she had, but he knew it had to be bad. If she had been gathering information on him, it meant his career, his entire life, was on the line. He glanced at his phone, hesitating before dialing a number. When the call connected, a voice answered, low and cautious. "You better have a good reason for calling me this early." "It's bad," Larson muttered, his throat dry. "Really bad." There was silence on the other end. "Then, how bad?" Larson swallowed hard. "She's got something on me. And if this goes to trial, I'm done." The voice on the other end sighed. "We'll handle it." Larson wasn't sure what that meant, but he wasn't sure he wanted to know either. All he knew was that he had backed himself into a corner, and now he needed to find a way out. Danielle sat in her office, reviewing the files spread out in front of her. She had been building this case for months, collecting reports, complaints, and body cam footage that told a story Larson and officers like him never thought would see the light of day. But there was one file in particular that made her pause. It wasn't just about Larson, it was about something bigger. A pattern. A network. Officers covering for each other, turning a blind eye, making sure the truth never made it past the station walls. She had suspected it for a while, but now she had proof. She picked up her phone and made a call. "It's time," she said simply. "We move forward." Meanwhile, Marcus stood outside the address from the note, shifting nervously on his feet. It was a quiet street, lined with brownstones, the kind of place he had never had a reason to be before. He hesitated before knocking. The door opened, and the woman from the bus stood there, smiling. "Right on time," she said. "Come in." Marcus stepped inside cautiously. The house was warm, filled with the smell of something sweet baking in the oven. The woman gestured for him to sit on the couch, and he did, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Do you know why you're here?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not really." She studied him for a moment before reaching into her purse and pulling out a small, folded-up letter. "I wasn't sure if I was going to do this," she said, her voice softer now. "But after what you did for me on that bus, I knew I had to." Marcus frowned. "I just gave you my seat." She smiled. "Exactly. You didn't have to, but you did. And that told me everything I needed to know about you." She handed him the letter, and he hesitated before opening it. As he read the words, his breath caught in his throat. His name. His birth name. Details about his childhood, things only someone who knew him from the very beginning would know. His hands started shaking. "I don't understand," he whispered. The woman placed a gentle hand on his. "Marcus, I'm your mother." His head snapped up, his heart pounding in his chest. "That's not possible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I gave you up when you were a baby," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "Not because I wanted to, because I had to." Marcus's mind spun, struggling to process the words. His whole life, he had never questioned where he came from. He had been raised by the only family he had ever known. But now, sitting in front of him was a woman who was saying she had carried him, given birth to him, and then let him go. Why? The word came out hoarse, raw. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Because I was in trouble, and keeping you with me would have put you in danger." Marcus clenched his jaw, his emotions warring inside him. Anger. Confusion. Pain. "So, you just left me?" She shook her head. "I never stopped thinking about you. Never stopped hoping one day I'd find you again. And when I saw you on that bus, I knew it was you." Marcus looked away, his chest tight. He had come here expecting answers, but now, all he had were more questions. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter sat in a dimly lit office, listening to a recording play over her computer speakers. Larson's voice. Another officer's voice. A conversation they never thought anyone would hear. "I don't care what the body cam shows," Larson's voice said. "We handle this the way we always do." A pause. "You sure about this?" the second voice asked. A chuckle. "They're not going to do anything. They never do." Danielle stopped the recording and leaned back in her chair. She had all the proof she needed. Now it was just a matter of what she did next. Larson, sitting in his car, had no idea that the walls were closing in. And Marcus, standing in front of the woman who had just changed his entire reality, had no idea that his life was about to take a turn he never saw coming. The tension in both of their worlds was building, and neither of them knew that soon everything would come crashing down. Marcus's breath came in uneven waves as he stared at the woman sitting across from him. His mother. The word felt foreign, almost unreal. He had never questioned where he came from, because he had never needed to. His mom, the woman who raised him, had always been enough. But now everything felt different. His world had tilted, and he wasn't sure how to steady it. His fingers tightened around the letter, the paper crinkling slightly in his grip. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rough. "After all this time, why now?" His birth mother, Lisa, she had introduced herself, exhaled shakily. "Because I finally could," she said. "Because I had no choice back then, but now I do." Marcus shook his head, his mind racing. "That doesn't make sense. What kind of trouble were you in?" Lisa hesitated, and in that moment, Marcus saw something flicker across her face, something she wasn't saying. Before he could press further, there was a knock on the door. Lisa tensed. "I wasn't expecting anyone." Marcus stood up, his heart still pounding from their conversation, but now something else settled in his gut, unease. Lisa moved cautiously toward the door, peeking through the peephole. When she pulled back, her face had gone pale. Marcus saw her fear before she even spoke. "Who is it?" he asked. She turned back to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay here." Before he could protest, she opened the door a crack. Marcus couldn't see who was on the other side, but he heard the voice clearly. "Lisa." The voice was deep, smooth, but there was something cold beneath it. "Long time no see." Lisa's grip on the door tightened. "What are you doing here?" The man on the other side let out a low chuckle. "We need to talk." Marcus took a step forward, but Lisa shot him a look that made him stop in his tracks. It was a look of warning, a look that told him this was bigger than he understood. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Larson sat in his car outside the station, his foot tapping anxiously against the floorboard. He had spent the last 24 hours trying to figure out how to get ahead of this, but every path led to the same conclusion. He was out of options. He had made some calls, reached out to people he thought could help, but the answers were the same. Too much heat. Too much exposure. Nobody wanted to touch this, which meant he was on his own. His phone buzzed on the dashboard. He grabbed it without hesitation. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was clipped. "It's worse than we thought." Larson felt a chill run through him. "How bad?" "She's got recordings. She's got reports. And now, she's got people talking." Larson gritted his teeth. "We can shut it down." The line was silent for a moment. Then, not this time. A sense of panic crawled up Larson's spine. This wasn't just about him anymore. If this thing blew up, it would take down more than just his career, it would take down everything. The people who had covered for him, the ones who had looked the other way, the whole system that had kept him protected for years. And if those people started talking to save themselves, he was done. Back in Lisa's apartment, Marcus listened closely, trying to make out what the man at the door was saying. He couldn't catch all of it, but he heard enough to know that this wasn't just some casual visit. "I told you to leave this alone," the man said. "But you didn't listen." Lisa's voice was tight. "I don't owe you anything." A pause. Then, the man's voice dropped lower. "That boy in there. You really want him getting involved in this?" Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Lisa stepped back, her body blocking the doorway slightly. "You don't touch him." The man chuckled. "That's up to you." Marcus had heard enough. He stepped forward, making himself seen. "Who is this?" he demanded. The man's eyes flicked to him, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You must be Marcus." Marcus clenched his jaw. "Who are you?" The man studied him for a long moment before looking back at Lisa. "Guess you haven't told him everything yet." Lisa's hands curled into fists. "Leave." The man took a step closer, his expression darkening. "You don't get to tell me what to do, Lisa." Marcus didn't know what was happening, but he knew one thing. This man wasn't just some old friend. He was someone dangerous. And for some reason, he had something to do with why Lisa had given him up. Meanwhile, Danielle Carter walked into the precinct with her head held high. She knew eyes were on her. She could feel the tension in the air, The unspoken knowledge that something big was about to go down. She had spent years fighting battles like this, but this one was different. This one wasn't just about taking down a bad cop. This was about sending a message. She walked straight to the captain's office, knocking once before stepping inside. The captain looked up, his face unreadable. "Carter." She set a file down on his desk. "We need to talk." He glanced at the file but didn't reach for it. "You sure about this?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Absolutely." The captain exhaled. "Then let's get to work." Back at Lisa's apartment, the man at the door finally took a step back. "We'll talk soon," he said, his gaze lingering on Marcus before he turned and walked away. Lisa shut the door quickly, locking it. When she turned back to Marcus, she looked shaken. Marcus folded his arms. "You gonna tell me what that was about?" Lisa hesitated. Then, with a heavy sigh, she sat down on the couch, rubbing her temples. "There's a lot you don't know, Marcus. A lot I never wanted you to have to know." Marcus sat beside her, his mind still racing. "Start talking." Lisa looked at him, her expression filled with something he couldn't quite place. Regret. Pain. Fear. And then she said something that made his blood run cold. "The man you just met, he's the reason I had to give you up?" Marcus's heart pounded. "Who is he?" Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father." The weight of her words crashed over him like a wave. And outside, in the shadows, the man stood watching, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. He wasn't done yet. Marcus felt like the air had been knocked out of his chest. His father, the man who had just stood in front of him, the man who made Lisa tense with fear, his father? It didn't make sense. His father had never been in the picture. His mom, the woman who raised him, had always told him that his real parents couldn't take care of him, that they had made the best decision they could. But she never said anything about danger. She never said anything about this. Lisa watched his reaction carefully, her hands gripping each other tightly. "I wanted to tell you in a better way," she said, her voice low, filled with regret. "But I didn't expect him to find us this fast." Marcus stood up, his body buzzing with nervous energy. "Who is he? I mean, really, what does he want?" Lisa hesitated, looking away for a moment, as if searching for the right words. When she spoke, her voice was almost too quiet to hear. "He's not just your father, Marcus. He's dangerous. He's connected to people who don't care about laws, don't care about right and wrong. And if he's here now, that means he wants something." Marcus's stomach twisted. "Connected? To who?" Lisa exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "Cops. Judges. People in power. The kind that get away with everything." Marcus felt a chill settle over him. "Are you saying He stopped himself before finishing the sentence, but the thought had already formed. His father wasn't just some guy with a bad history. He was involved. Lisa nodded, understanding exactly what he was thinking. He's part of the same corruption that Danielle Carter is trying to bring down. Marcus's head spun. It didn't seem real, but as he stood there, all the pieces started clicking together. The way Lisa had disappeared from his life. The way she was so afraid. The way that man had looked at him, like he already owned him. And then another terrifying thought crept in. Did he know about me? Lisa swallowed hard before nodding. He always knew. Marcus sat back down, his pulse hammering. His entire life, he thought he had just been given up. He thought his parents made a choice and moved on. But now he was realizing something far worse. He hadn't just been given up. He had been hidden. Meanwhile, Officer Larson was spiraling. He had never been this deep in trouble before, and now, it was like everything was unraveling at once. He had spent his career keeping things buried, covering his tracks, making sure the people who needed to stay silent stayed that way. But now, Danielle Carter had everything. Or so she thought. Larson's fingers drummed anxiously against the steering wheel. He had called in every favor he had left, but it wasn't enough. He needed a way out. A real one. And that meant he needed help. His phone buzzed again, and this time he grabbed it like it was a lifeline. "You're desperate," the voice on the other end said, sounding amused. Larson didn't bother denying it. "I need this problem handled. Now." The voice was silent for a moment before responding. "It's already in motion." Larson's breath hitched. "What does that mean?" Another pause. Then the voice said, You don't need to worry about Danielle Carter anymore. Someone else is going to handle her. A cold feeling settled over Larson. He knew what that meant. He had been in this game long enough to understand the way things worked. And suddenly, he wasn't sure if he should feel relieved or terrified. Back at Lisa's apartment, Marcus was still trying to process everything when Lisa's phone rang. She stiffened before glancing at the screen. The color drained from her face. Marcus leaned forward. "Who is it?" Lisa didn't answer right away. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the phone and put it on speaker. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end was smooth, controlled. His voice. Lisa, is that any way to greet me?" His father's voice sent an eerie chill down Marcus's spine. "We have a lot to talk about." Lisa's jaw clenched. "I have nothing to say to you." There was a pause before his father's tone darkened. "You really think you can keep him from me?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. Lisa's voice was steel. "He's not yours." His father let out a quiet chuckle, the kind that sent warning bells ringing in Marcus's head. "You and I both know that's not true. He's mine. And it's time he learned what that really means." Marcus couldn't stay silent any longer. "I don't belong to you." The chuckle on the other end stopped. There was silence for a long moment, then a slow exhale. "Marcus," his father said, his voice now even softer. "We need to meet." Marcus's hands curled into fists. "Not happening." His father sighed. "I was hoping you'd say yes. But either way, we will see each other soon." The call ended. Lisa stared at the phone, her breathing shaky. "Marcus, listen to me. You can't go near him. You cannot." Before she could finish, there was a loud bang from outside. Lisa jumped to her feet. Marcus's heart slammed against his ribs. Someone was outside the apartment. Lisa rushed to the window, barely peeking through the blinds before quickly stepping back. Her face was pale. Marcus stood. "Who is it?" Lisa's voice was quiet, urgent. "We have to go. Now." Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed his things, following Lisa as she hurried toward the back door. The tension in the air was suffocating, every second stretching out like an eternity. Another bang. Then, the doorknob rattled. Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears. Lisa turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "No matter what happens, you run." And then the front door burst open. Lisa barely had time to react before the front door crashed open, slamming against the wall. The apartment was instantly filled with heavy footsteps, the sound of men moving in fast. Marcus's heart pounded as adrenaline surged through him. Lisa grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the back door. But before they could make it out, a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Going somewhere?" Marcus turned sharply and found himself face to face with his father. The man's eyes locked onto him with a strange mixture of amusement and possession, like he had already won. Behind him, two men stood with weapons holstered at their sides, their presence radiating silent intimidation. Lisa stepped in front of Marcus, her body tense. "Stay away from him," his father smirked, tilting his head slightly. "Lisa, you always were so dramatic." His gaze flickered to Marcus. "I just want to talk." Lisa shook her head. "You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk in here and pretend you have some right to him." Marcus felt his pulse hammering, but he forced himself to speak. "Why are you doing this?" His father's expression shifted, his smirk fading. "Because you're my son." Marcus clenched his fists. "I don't even know you." His father exhaled, as if disappointed. "That's the problem, Marcus. You don't know me, and that means you don't know what you are." Lisa moved, shielding Marcus more, but his father didn't react. Instead, he simply studied Marcus, as if waiting for something. "I'm nothing like you," Marcus finally said. His father gave a slow nod, but there was something in his eyes, something knowing. "Not yet." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder by the second. A flicker of irritation crossed his father's face before he glanced at his men. "Time's up." Lisa didn't hesitate. She grabbed Marcus's wrist, pulling him toward the back. His father didn't stop them. Instead, his voice followed them like a shadow. "I'll see you soon, son." Then they were out the door. The cold night air hit Marcus's skin as they ran down the fire escape. Lisa moved fast, her grip strong, guiding him through the darkness. He could still hear the sirens closing in, but another sound made his stomach drop, the unmistakable screech of tires. A black car rounded the corner ahead of them, blocking their path. Lisa cursed under her breath, her eyes darting around. The alley they had run into was tight, no easy way out. Marcus turned back, hearing the footsteps behind them. His father's men were coming. Lisa pressed something into Marcus's hand. "Take this and run." Marcus looked down. It was a key. Lisa's voice was urgent. "Locker 312. Bus station." Marcus's breath hitched. "What's in there?" She grabbed his shoulders. "The truth. Now go." Before he could argue, she shoved him toward the side of the alley, toward a fence. Marcus hesitated for a second too long. That's when the shots rang out. Lisa staggered. Marcus's world slowed. He barely registered her pushing him toward the fence before she turned to face the men closing in. "Go," she shouted. Marcus's legs moved before his brain caught up. He scrambled up the fence, gripping the cold metal, pulling himself over just as he heard more shots behind him. He didn't look back. He couldn't. His feet hit the ground on the other side, and he ran. The city blurred around him, the streets swallowing him whole. He didn't stop until he reached the bus station. His hands were shaking as he found the locker, slipping the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a thick envelope inside. Marcus grabbed it, his breath ragged as he tore it open. Inside were photos, documents, names, and at the top the one thing that made his blood run cold. A file on Officer Larson. Marcus flipped through the pages, his heart racing. His father, Larson. Corruption deeper than he could have imagined. And at the very bottom, a handwritten note. "Marcus, if you're reading this, you know the truth. It's your choice now. You can run or you can fight. But whatever you do, don't let them win." The signature at the bottom made his throat tighten. Danielle Carter. Before Marcus could process what it meant, a shadow fell over him. He turned sharply. His father stood there alone this time, his hands in his pockets. "You really think a few papers change anything?" His voice was calm, but there was a challenge in it. Marcus tightened his grip on the file. "They change everything." His father chuckled. "Then let's see what you're willing to do about it." Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle on him. His whole life had led to this. He had a choice to make. And this time, he wasn't going to run. Marcus's fingers tightened around the file, his heart hammering in his chest. His father stood in front of him, his expression unreadable. The cold night air felt heavier now, like the entire world had shrunk to just the space between them. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then his father took a slow step forward. "You don't have to do this, Marcus." Marcus shook his head. "You don't get to decide that." His father exhaled, glancing at the folder in Marcus's hands. "That information, do you really think it'll change anything? People like me, we don't lose." Marcus felt something rise in him, something that had been building since the moment he learned the truth. He had spent his life thinking he was just another kid trying to find his place, but now he realized his entire existence had been a secret. A hidden piece in a game he didn't even know he was playing. But that was over. He met his father's gaze. "Maybe you don't lose. But I know someone who doesn't stop fighting." For the first time, something flickered in his father's expression. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. He could see it now. The shift in Marcus. The realization that he wasn't just going to walk away. Marcus took a slow step back. "I'm not running anymore." His father sighed, almost disappointed. "That's what I was afraid of." Marcus's grip on the file tightened, but before he could react, the sound of tires screeching against pavement filled the air. Bright headlights cut through the darkness as several cars pulled up to the bus station. Doors slammed. Footsteps rushed toward them. His father glanced over his shoulder just as a commanding voice rang out. "Hands where I can see them." Marcus turned and saw her. Danielle Carter. Her presence was electric, her sharp eyes locking onto his father. Several officers stood behind her, weapons drawn, their expressions unreadable but firm. His father slowly raised his hands, his jaw tightening. "Danielle," he said smoothly. "This is unexpected." Danielle didn't so much as blink. "It really isn't." Marcus stepped forward, holding up the folder. "This has everything. The corruption, the cover-ups, everything you've done." Danielle nodded, her gaze never leaving his father. We already have enough to bring him in. But this? She took the folder from Marcus, flipping through it. This makes it impossible for him to escape. His father remained eerily calm. You think locking me up will change anything? Danielle took a step closer, lowering her voice. I don't need to change everything. Just enough. Marcus watched as his father's face remained emotionless, but he could see it now, the truth settling in. His father had always operated with the belief that he was untouchable, that no matter what, the system would protect him. But not this time. Danielle turned to the officers behind her. Take him in. For the first time, his father's composure wavered. This is a mistake, he said coldly. You don't know what you're doing. Danielle tilted her head. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. The officers moved in, locking handcuffs around his wrists. For a second, his father turned his gaze back to Marcus. There was no anger in his expression, no desperation, just something cold and quiet, as if he was already planning his next move. Marcus stared back, refusing to look away. And then, just like that, his father was escorted toward the police cars, his future no longer in his own hands. Marcus felt the tension in his body slowly start to fade, but he knew this wasn't over. Not completely. Danielle turned to him. You okay? Marcus exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I think so. Danielle studied him for a moment, then nodded. Lisa? Marcus swallowed hard, his chest tightening. She saved me. Danielle's expression softened slightly, and she reached out, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Then let's make sure her fight wasn't for nothing. Marcus felt a lump in his throat but nodded. He wasn't the same person he had been before all of this. He had seen too much, learned too much. And now, he had a choice. He could walk away, try to live a normal life, or he could do something with what he knew. He thought about Lisa, about everything she had risked. His choice was clear. A few weeks later, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, watching as reporters swarmed the area, covering the case that had rocked the city. His father's trial was beginning, and for the first time, people were seeing the truth. The system that had protected him for so long was finally breaking apart. Danielle stood beside him, watching the chaos unfold. It's not over yet, she said. Marcus nodded. I know. She studied him for a moment. So what now? Marcus thought about everything that had happened. The way his world had changed. The way he had changed. Then he turned to Danielle, his voice steady. Now? We keep fighting. Danielle smiled slightly, nodding. Good answer. As the courthouse doors opened and the trial officially began, Marcus knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning.